I was left exactly $1 in my grandfather's will. Not 1%. Not one painting. Not one apology. Just a crisp, humiliating dollar bill handed to me in front of every relative I've ever tried to prove myself to. And they laughed. Jason, my cousin, actually clapped. "Guess that's what you get for skipping business school," he said, sipping a $200 glass of brandy like he'd just delivered the punchline of a family tradition. My Aunt Valerie, in her designer suit and diamond earrings, offered a tight, condescending smile. "Well, Elena, perhaps now you'll understand the importance of real-world choices." I sat there, frozen, heart pounding, cheeks burning, mind racing through every moment I thought my grandfather believed in me. He came to my gallery openings. He once said my photos captured silence better than most people capture words. He hugged me at my college graduation when my own parents didn't show. So what was this? A final rejection? A twisted joke? I wanted to walk out, to scream, to cry. But then, Mr. Beckett, the attorney, quietly said, "Miss Carter, please stay behind after the reading. Your grandfather left something separate." Something separate? My pulse jumped. Was this another insult? Another trick? Or had the man who raised an empire of media and power actually hidden one last message in plain sight? At that moment, I didn't know if I was being punished or protected. What I did know was that nothing would ever be the same after today. And neither would I. Growing up as a Carter meant one thing. You were either part of the legacy, or you were the stain on its glossy brand. Our family wasn't just wealthy. We were curated, polished, packaged like the very media empire my grandfather built from a single radio station into an international communications conglomerate Whitmore Global. There were brand guidelines for everything in our lives. From what colleges we attended, to how we spoke at charity galas, to what topics were off-brand at Thanksgiving. And then there was me. I was the off-brand Carter. While my cousins were studying finance, law, and public relations at Ivy League schools, I was in a darkroom, developing black and white photos of subway riders and street musicians. While Aunt Valerie sent Heather to Switzerland for a summer leadership immersion program, I hitchhiked across the West Coast photographing migrant workers and abandoned train stations. No one said I was disowned. That would have been messy. Instead, I was encouraged to take a gap year. And then another. And then another. The message was clear. You are not what we want the Carter name to represent. But I didn't care. At least, that's what I told myself. In truth, I cared deeply. Every time they looked past me at family dinners. Every time they asked if I was still doing that little camera thing. Every time someone mentioned how brilliant Jason was for being promoted to Vice President of Strategy at 29, while I was selling $300 prints out of a shared art co-op. I wasn't just an outsider. I was a disruption. To them, legacy meant stock options and legacy seating at the opera. To me, legacy was about capturing moments that mattered. Faces no one else noticed. Stories no one else cared to tell. And yet, there was one person who didn't seem to mind the way I told stories. My grandfather. Richard Whitmore was never warm knot in the way movies portray grandfathers anyway. He didn't bake cookies or read bedtime stories. But sometimes, when everyone else was bragging about mergers or gala invitations, he'd catch my eye across the table and just nod. A small, subtle thing, but it felt like permission. When I had my first photo published in a city magazine, he sent a clipping of it back to me in the mail with just 2 words written in his distinct scrawl. Keep going. I kept that note for years. And that's what made today hurt even more. I didn't need millions. I didn't expect the company. But I thought, maybe, he'd leave me something that meant he saw me. Now I wasn't so sure. Because today, I hadn't just been cut out of the will. I'd been branded, stamped with a label that told everyone in that room, Elena Carter is not part of this legacy. And that label wasn't just printed in ink. It was delivered with a smirk, a laugh, and the sickening echo of a single dollar. The first time I saw my grandfather at one of my gallery shows, I thought I was imagining it. It was a Thursday evening in Brooklyn, one of those humid summer nights where the air sticks to your skin and the city never really quiets down. I had scraped together enough to rent a wall laterally, just one wall in a shared exhibit space. My work was sandwiched between a surrealist oil painter and someone who built sculptures out of discarded tech parts. And there, across the crowded room, dressed in his signature navy blazer and gray slacks, stood Richard Whitmore, the titan of media, the man whose name opened doors I'd never been invited through. He was half hidden behind a marble column, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I remember freezing. I blinked, looked again, and he was gone. I convinced myself it had been someone else. A look-alike. A ghost, maybe. But then it happened again. 2 months later, at a warehouse show in Soho, an underground exhibit focused on the beauty of decay, I saw him again. Same blazer, same stillness. Only this time, he stayed long enough for our eyes to meet. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just a quiet nod. Then he disappeared into the crowd. He never spoke to me at those shows. Never emailed, never followed up. He was a phantom supporter. A shadow in the corner of every room I thought I was standing in alone. And I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me felt honored. Another part, confused. Why wouldn't he say anything? Why keep it a secret? Did he believe in my work, or was he just curious about the rebel granddaughter everyone whispered about at family brunch? I tried to ask once. I called him after one of the shows, voice shaking. Left a voicemail that said, "I think I saw you tonight. If it was you, thank you." He never called back. I told myself to stop looking for him. That my work was for me, not for his approval. But I still found myself scanning every gallery for that flash of navy wool. And when he wasn't there, the absence felt loud. Like a missing frame in a film reel. The truth is, I built my career trying to tell stories no one wanted to hear. But I think, deep down, I still wanted him to hear mine. Not because I needed his money, but because, in some strange, stubborn way, I wanted to believe he saw something in me that the rest of the family didn't. And then came the funeral. Private. Cold. Efficient. No eulogies. No tears. Just legal documents and family members eyeing each other like stockholders at a boardroom takeover. The man who had once looked at me across a room full of strangers now lay silent in a closed casket, and I was left with nothing but fragments. Moments. Glances. And a $1 insult that threatened to shatter everything I thought I knew. I wasn't just grieving a grandfather. I was grieving a mystery I might never solve. Or so I thought. I should have left right after the laughter. The reading was over. The will had been signed, stamped, and distributed like party favors. Jason had already made 3 jokes at my expense. Aunt Valerie looked ready to order champagne. And me? I was holding a printed check for $1, still warm from the envelope, like it might burn a hole in my skin. I tucked it into my purse without looking at anyone. Stood up, smiled that tight, survival smile you practice when you grow up around people who measure your worth in dollar signs and last names. "I'll see myself out," I muttered. No one stopped me. No one cared. I was 3 steps from the door, halfway into my exit, when I heard his voice. "Miss Carter, would you mind staying a moment?" It was Mr. Beckett, my grandfather's attorney. He stood calmly at the far end of the polished mahogany table, still flipping through pages in that thick, leather-bound folder. Like this was just another Tuesday. I paused, turned halfway back. His tone wasn't dramatic. There was no pause for effect. Just. Neutral. Procedural. But there was something in his eyes, quiet, deliberate, that made me freeze. I glanced around the room. No one else even looked up. Jason was checking his phone. Heather was applying lip gloss in a silver compact. I hesitated. "Is there a problem?" I asked, cautiously. Mr. Beckett adjusted his glasses. "Not a problem, but your grandfather left a separate instruction. A private one." That word again. Separate. My heart, which had barely begun to slow after the emotional gut punch of the will, now jolted back to full alert. Separate? What did that even mean? Was this another layer of humiliation? A final dig? Some weird legal formality I needed to sign before they handed me a branded coffee mug with the words, "Rebellious Granddaughter" on it. Still, I stayed. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when mixed with grief and pride. "I can wait," I said flatly. But Mr. Beckett shook his head. "I'd prefer to speak with you alone. It may take some time." Jason looked up now, interested. "Oh, what is it? A loyalty waiver? Maybe she has to promise not to sue for emotional damage over that dollar." I didn't even flinch. Didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Mr. Beckett, to his credit, didn't either. He simply turned to the rest of the room and said, "This concludes today's proceedings. Thank you all. My associate will show you out." End of. Valerie opened her mouth, clearly about to object, but then Beckett added, without even looking at her, "Of course, if you'd prefer to stay, I'm sure Elena won't mind discussing private matters in a room full of shareholders." That shut her down. Within minutes, the room emptied. One by one, my relatives gathered their coats and smug expressions, filed out of the conference room, and disappeared behind the frosted glass doors. And just like that, I was alone again. Only this time, someone had asked me to stay. I stood in the silence, unsure of what came next. A second will? A secret dette? One last goodbye from a man who had mastered the art of silence? Whatever it was, I braced myself. Because if that dollar had cut deep, I had a feeling what came next might go even deeper. The door clicked shut behind them with a soft, final sound. For the first time all morning, the room felt still. Mr. Beckett didn't speak right away. He waited head, tilted slightly, like he was listening for the last footsteps to fade. Then, he turned to me. His expression had changed. Gone was the formal mask of the neutral attorney. In its place was something quieter, more human, almost expectant. "Elena," he said, gently, "please, sit." I hesitated. The chair he gestured to wasn't the one I'd sat in earlier, the one at the far end of the table where the forgotten relative sat. "Number." He pointed to the head of the table. "Grandfather's seat." A chill ran through me. I almost laughed. Was this a setup? A mind game? Still, my legs moved on their own. I sat. Mr. Beckett reached into his folder and pulled out a smaller envelope, cream-colored, thick paper, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Whitmore family crest. My name was handwritten across the front in ink I recognized instantly. His handwriting. "Elena, before I give you this," Mr. Beckett began, "there's something you should know. Your grandfather was a very careful man. In his final months, he became even more so." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had tightened around my breath. 8 months ago, he continued, he was diagnosed with a terminal illness. He told no one. Not your aunt. Not your cousins. Not the board. Only me. And during that time, he began making very deliberate preparations. He placed the envelope in front of me with a quiet reverence. "This," he said, "was the most important of them. Alla Ken." My fingers trembled as I reached for it. The wax seal was unbroken. He'd written only 2 words on the back. "Read alone." Mr. Beckett stood. "I'll wait just outside. Take your time." And just like that, I was alone again. Only this time, not forgotten. I stared at the envelope for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, I broke the seal. Inside were several folded pages thick stationery, covered in that same bold, looping script that used to sign company deals and birthday cards in the same motion. The first line stopped me cold. "If you're reading this, then the theatrics of my public will have done their job." I swallowed. "I imagine you're angry, hurt, maybe even ready to walk away from everything. If so, I understand, but please finish this letter first." The words blurred for a moment. I blinked hard. You were always different, Elena. Not difficult, not rebellious, just unwilling to be bought. And in this family, that's more dangerous than anything. My heart pounded louder with each sentence. This wasn't an apology. It wasn't a riddle. It was a confession. And I hadn't even reached the part that would change everything. I read the letter once, then again, and then a third time, slower, like maybe the meaning would shift if I lingered on certain words. It didn't. Each line landed like a slow-moving avalanche, burying every assumption I'd made in the last 24 hours under something heavier truth. He had left me everything. Not the scraps. Not the leftovers. 80% of his estate. The majority of the shares in Whitmore Global. The family foundation. The penthouses. The art. The power. And the letter made something else painfully clear. This wasn't a moment of whim. It had been orchestrated. Every cold glance. Every vague nod at my gallery shows. Every silent visit. All of it had been part of some long game I hadn't even known I was playing. And now, I had won without knowing the rules. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt unsteady. Like the floor had shifted under me and I was still pretending I had balance. Mr. Beckett returned quietly. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply said, "There's something I'd like to show you." We left the law office without ceremony, no fanfare, no black SUVs or bodyguards. Just two people walking through the buzzing streets of Manhattan. Like this wasn't the beginning of an empire shifting hands. We drove in silence to a building I'd passed 100 times before without ever noticing. A brownstone tucked between two high-rises in the West Village. Elegant. Old money. Unassuming. We took a private elevator up to the top floor. No buttons. Just a key. And when the doors opened, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the luxury. Though, yes, the space was immaculate floor-to-ceiling windows, hand-carved moldings, curated lighting. It was what lined the walls. My work. Photographs from every phase of my career. The early, gritty shots from train platforms and fire escapes. The tender portraits from protest marches. Even the mistakes I never published, images I'd sworn I'd deleted. All framed. All spotlighted. All here. I turned to Mr. Beckett. Stunned. He collected everything, I whispered. He did, he said. Every piece. He bought them under aliases, different names, different buyers, so you wouldn't suspect. I walked the length of the penthouse, heart thudding, fingertips trailing the edges of frames I barely remembered creating. This wasn't a gallery. This was a timeline. A map of how I'd become curated, not for profit, but for remembrance. He believed in you, Mr. Beckett added quietly. More than you ever knew. I stopped in front of a photograph I'd taken during a trip to Detroit. It showed an elderly woman sitting on a stoop, holding a photo album in her lap, her eyes locked on something just beyond the lens. I'd titled it "The Things We Hold." Now, I finally understood why he'd loved it. Because he had been holding something, too. A belief. A legacy. One he didn't entrust to the heirs who memorized spreadsheets, but to the one who had learned to see. That night, I stayed in the penthouse. Not because it was luxurious, but because it was quiet. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove I belonged somewhere. I just did. It didn't take long for the invitation to arrive. A cream-colored envelope with gold lettering. My name, handwritten delicate, slanted like a polite threat in cursive. Family dinner. To honor Richard Whitmore's legacy. Hosted by Aunt Valerie. At the townhouse on East 73rd. Where portraits of ancestors hung like sentinels and the silverware was older than most marriages in the room. I almost didn't go. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew exactly what it was. A performance. This wasn't about mourning my grandfather. It was about resetting the hierarchy. Valerie, as the eldest, was stepping into the power vacuum. Jason would be paraded like the golden calf. And I was meant to sit quietly in the corner, sipping wine I couldn't pronounce and pretending I hadn't been humiliated in front of them all just days before. But I went. Not for them. For me. Because something had shifted inside me since reading that letter and walking through that penthouse. I didn't need to win anymore. I didn't need applause or apologies. But I wanted to look them in the eye, knowing what I knew. I arrived 10 minutes late on purpose. Enough to disrupt the rhythm, but not enough to be considered rude. My dress was simple but elegant. Dark green silk. No logo. No flash. Just intentional. I walked in, and the conversation paused just a beat. Not long enough to be awkward, but long enough to feel it. Jason raised an eyebrow. Heather blinked twice. Valerie stood, air-kissed both my cheeks, and smiled like a seasoned politician greeting a rival. "Darling, how lovely of you to come," she purred. "Of course," I said, with a smile of my own. "Wouldn't miss it." We made small talk. Chardonnay. Weather. A new gallery opening in Soho that Valerie pretended to care about. I said very little, but I watched everything. How Jason dominated the room with false charm. How Heather hovered on the edge, always trying to impress, never quite landing. How Valerie maintained control through compliments that felt like veiled corrections. It was all so fragile, so theatrical. Dinner was served on bone china in the formal dining room where every chair had a ranking and every comment was a move on the board. Halfway through the meal, Jason turned to me with a smirk. "So," he said, swirling his wine, "any new photography projects? Or did the dollar check finally convince you to try something more practical?" The table chuckled. I just smiled. "Actually," I said, softly, "I've been working on something long-term. Legacy-focused." Valerie raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Something inspired by grandfather, actually," I added, lifting my glass. "To legacy. The kind that outlives even a name." It was subtle, but I watched the flicker in her eyes. The tiny pause in Jason's breath. They didn't know yet, but something in them felt it. Something had changed. And this time, I didn't have to announce it. I just had to let it unfold. It started quietly. Not with a headline. Not with a press conference. Just a line of fine print tucked deep inside an SEC filing. But in a family like mine where everyone reads the business section before their morning coffee, that line was enough to detonate a bomb. Majority ownership of Whitmore Global transferred to Elena Carter, effective immediately. By the time I woke up that morning, my phone had already imploded. 12 missed calls. 7 voicemails. 3 messages from Jason, each more frantic than the last. I let them all go to voicemail. Instead, I sat on the windowsill of the penthouse my grandfather had left me, watching the city move beneath my feet. Cars honking. People rushing. Deals being made in buildings I now technically owned. It was surreal. I didn't feel powerful. I felt calm. For the first time in my life, the silence wasn't empty. It was earned. The storm hit around noon. Jason showed up first. He didn't knock. He buzzed the doorman 10 times until security called me upstairs. I let him in not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to see how long it would take for the mask to crack. He didn't waste time. "This has to be a mistake," he said, pacing like a trapped animal. "There's no way grandfather would have given you controlling interest. I mean, you're an artist." "Correct," I said, pouring myself coffee. "And yet, here we are." He laughed sharp, hollow. "Look, you don't understand how this works. There are votes, there are boards. I've been in the company for a decade. You can't just walk in and—" "Jason," I interrupted. "You can relax. I'm not here to take your job, or fire anyone, or burn the place down." He blinked. I let the pause linger, then added, "But I am here, and I'm not leaving." The mask cracked. Just for a moment. A flicker of fear, quickly replaced with indignation. "You don't deserve this." He tilted my head. "And you do?" Before he could answer, The elevator chimed again. Aunt Valerie. Of course. She entered like she owned the air in the room. Lipstick, perfect, heels sharp enough to draw blood. Jason, she said, voice clipped. Give us a moment. Jason hesitated, then left without another word. She waited until the door shut. Then she turned to me. I see the filings went through. Looks like it. Do you have any idea what kind of position this puts the family in? I met her Gaza. Steady. Calm. Yes, I said. Exactly the kind my grandfather intended. She stepped closer. You could ruin everything. Or, I said, I could rebuild it. The silence between us stretched. Then, softer, more calculated. You don't have to do this alone, Elena. Let us help you, guide you. We've been managing the legacy for decades. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. I think I'll manage. Her expression froze. Just for a heartbeat. That's when I knew. The thrones they'd been sitting on for years weren't crumbling. They were already dust. They just hadn't noticed. Until now. I didn't inherit a company. I inherited a machine. One built on control, image, and silence. One that had been running so long, no one questioned the fuel it burned, only whether it looked good doing it. And for years, I thought the only way to survive was to stay out of its way. But now, I sat at the controls. And I didn't want to keep it running. I wanted to repurpose it. It started with a question. Not to the board. Not to the shareholders. To myself. What would happen if we stopped broadcasting stories that sell and started supporting stories that matter? I met with the foundation team first half, expecting resistance, defensiveness, maybe even sabotage. But what I found surprised me. Tired faces. Muted ambition. People who'd spent years approving safe donations to safe causes because that's what was expected. They weren't villains. Just exhausted curators of a legacy no one had dared to touch. So I touched it. I proposed a complete restructuring of the Whitmore Foundation, shifting its focus toward grassroots arts, education, community-based storytelling, and direct support for emerging artists across the country. And I didn't just want grants. I wanted infrastructure. Studios. Residencies. Free creative spaces in neighborhoods the Whitmore family had once gentrified in the name of urban renewal. The pushback came, of course. Jason called it reckless philanthropy. Valerie said I was trying to turn a media legacy into a charity case. Even Heather warned me I was moving too fast. But I wasn't listening to them anymore. I was listening to the kid I used to be, the one who had taken photos with a secondhand camera under a leaking subway roof, praying someone would see what she saw. And I was listening to the quiet voice of a man who had once written, "You chose vision over validation. That's the legacy I believe in." Ablu. I found a dilapidated warehouse in Brooklyn, one we used to pass on the way to family dinners and pretend not to see. I bought it under my own name, gutted it, and turned it into something no one in my family had ever built. The Whitmore House of Vision. An open studio. A gallery for underrepresented artists. A recording room for community journalists. A rooftop garden for spoken word nights. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't polished. But it was true. Opening day was quiet. No cameras. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just a handful of artists, a few community members, and me. We hung the first exhibit ourselves, portraits taken by teens in East Harlem documenting their block, their families, their fears. One of the boys, maybe 17, looked up at me and said, "You're the lady who owns this?" I nodded. He looked around, eyes wide. "All this, just so people can see what we see." I smiled. Exactly that. All Bryn. That night, I stood in the middle of the space, surrounded by stories no one had paid attention to before. And for the first time, I felt it, not just gratitude, not just peace. Power. But not the kind they taught in boardrooms. The kind that comes from telling your truth out loud and giving others permission to do the same. Change doesn't arrive like lightning. It seeps in quietly like sunlight creeping through shutters you didn't realize you left open. And in the weeks following the launch of the Whitmore House of Vision, the calls began to change tone. No more demands. No more veiled threats. Just questions. Soft ones. Uncertain ones. Jason was first again. But this time, he didn't come storming into the penthouse or fire off a 5-paragraph email. He texted, "You free to talk?" Just that. When we met, it was at a café, a boardroom. He wore jeans instead of a suit. No watch. No tie. He looked tired. "Look," he began. "I know I was a jerk at the will reading, and after, and pretty much always." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a decent summary." He gave a short laugh. Not defensive, just real. "I thought I had this future mapped out," he said. Then suddenly, the map wasn't mine anymore, and I panicked. I said things I shouldn't have. I stayed quiet. He took a breath. "But I've been watching what you're doing with the foundation. The gallery. That's bigger than I ever expected. Bigger than the way we were taught to think." Another pause. He looked at me, almost like he was trying to recognize someone he'd never really seen before. "I was wrong about you, Elena." That moment didn't erase years of mockery. It didn't rebuild trust overnight, but it cracked something open. And that mattered. Heather came next and announced, but not unwelcome. She showed up at the Vision House on a rainy Thursday. Said she just wanted to see the space. We walked the gallery in silence. When we reached a series of portraits taken by a young mother documenting her life with twin sons, Heather stopped in front of one image, just a pair of hands holding a lunchbox. "She works a full-time job and still packs these every day," I explained. "She said it's the one thing she can control." Heather nodded, eyes glassy. "I don't think I've ever worked for something that wasn't expected of me," she whispered. Then she looked at me. "How did you know who you were supposed to be?" The question hit harder than I expected. Because the truth was I didn't. Not always. But I knew who I wasn't. And I never stopped pushing toward the rest. "You don't have to get it right all at once," I told her. "You just have to stop pretending it doesn't matter." And Aunt Valerie? She didn't reach out right away. But when she did, it wasn't through a lawyer. Or an assistant. Or some carefully worded letter. She invited me to lunch. Just us. No scripts. No wine-fueled manipulation. She didn't apologize. Not exactly. But somewhere between the appetizer and the silence that followed, she said, "Your grandfather saw something in you. I fought that for a long time. But maybe I was fighting the part of myself that never got to choose." It wasn't closure. Not yet. But it was honest. And in a family built on appearances, honesty was more revolutionary than anything else. The gallery was quiet just before opening night. A rare kind of quiet. Not empty. Not tense. Just full of waiting. I stood in the center of the main room at the Whitmore House of Vision, surrounded by stories framed on every wall. Not headlines. Not curated legacies. But raw, honest slices of life captured by hands that had never been handed a spotlight until now. This exhibit was different. It wasn't just mine. It was a conversation, 3 voices, 3 generations. One wall was dedicated to my grandfather's secret photographs. Black and white street images from the 1970s. Unpolished. Tender. They showed New York not from a penthouse window, but from the sidewalk, old men playing chess, kids running barefoot through open hydrants, a woman standing under a flickering neon sign with her coat pulled tight against the wind. Photos he'd never published, never even shared. But they were good, really good. Better, maybe, than mine. Across from those images were selections from my own work. Pieces I'd created when I still thought no one was watching. Moments I'd frozen because I didn't know how to keep them any other way. And in between, uncensored, spotlighted, were photos taken by the newest voices. Young artists from underserved communities, scholarship recipients, first-time exhibitors. Their work wasn't flawless, but it was fearless. I liked that. By the time guests began to arrive, the room had transformed into something electro-buzzing with curiosity, with cautious awe. Critics took notes. Collectors asked questions. Former skeptics from my family lingered in the corners, pretending not to be overwhelmed. Aunt Valerie walked the exhibit slowly, pausing longer in front of my grandfather's photographs than anyone else. Jason kept his distance, but nodded when we made eye contact. Heather brought her sketchbook and sat on a bench for almost an hour, drawing quietly in the background. But the moment that stayed with me came near the end of the night. An older woman approached. Sharp eyes, silver hair, modest coat. She stood in front of one of my grandfather's photos, an image of a man reading a newspaper under a broken streetlight, and whispered, "I used to live on that block." I turned to her. "Really?" She nodded. He captured it exactly as it was. Not how people wanted to see it, but how it felt. I smiled. That was always his gift. She looked at me, then at the wall of new artists. "And now it's yours." It was the first time I let myself believe that. Not because of the money, or the company, or even the gallery, but because I had finally understood what he meant by inheritance. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't control. It was the responsibility to use what we're given to elevate others, to preserve truth, to carry forward a vision that outlives us. That night, after everyone left and the lights dimmed, I stood alone in the center of the room. 3 generations. 1 legacy. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready to carry it. 1 year to the day after my grandfather's will turned my life upside down, I stood on the rooftop of the Vision House, watching the city glow beneath a lavender dusk. The noise was still there, always humming, always alive. But something inside me had quieted. Not settled. Just anchored. I thought a lot that evening about the word legacy. How we treat it like a monument heavy, carved in stone, untouchable. But maybe legacy isn't what we leave behind. Maybe it's what we choose to continue, what we carry forward, reshape, and release into the world in new forms. A few hours earlier, Mr. Beckett had handed me one last envelope. It was smaller than the others. Just 1 page. On the front, in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. "For when the noise fades." Inside was a single sentence. "Wealth is a tool. Vision is a compass. Let neither become your cage." I read it 3 times, and then I folded it gently, slid it into the back of my journal, and smiled. Because I finally understood. He hadn't given me power. He'd given me freedom and the responsibility to use it well. And the truth is, wealth is the easy part. It gives you access. It opens doors. But if you're not careful, it starts speaking louder than your voice. Louder than your truth. Louder than your purpose. And I never want to lose that. That's why I still carry the $1 check in my wallet. Framed now in plastic, like a relic. Not as a reminder of the insult, but of the moment I thought I was worth nothing, and learned I already had everything I needed. My lens. My voice. My perspective. That was always the real inheritance. Not the shares. Not the penthouse. Not even the foundation. But the choice to define success on my own terms. To choose depth over display. Purpose over performance. And here's what I'll leave you with. If you're still waiting for someone to recognize your value, to give you permission, to hand you your place at the table, you don't need to wait. Build your own table. Invite people who see you, not what you produce. Speak even if your voice trembles. Create even if no one claps. Because some of the most powerful stories are the ones that never made the front page. They live in small rooms, on gallery walls, in quiet acts of courage that most people will never see. But you will know. You will remember. And that's enough. That's legacy. Not carved in marble, but lived, moment by moment, beyond the frame.